Hello everyone! Today we're going to talk about one of those is it or is it not a Christmas movie movies, 1957's An Affair to Remember. Directed by Leo McCarey, Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr star as a man and woman on a cruise who meet and fall in love. Trouble is, they're both involved with other people. As the journey ends, they agree to sort out their lives and meet again at the top of the Empire State Building in 6 months. But on the big day, tragedy strikes. This is considered one of the most romantic films ever made. It's a famous tearjerker and pretty iconic, too. I don't think I can ever mention the title, or the Empire State Building, or Deborah Kerr, or say something like I was looking up without my mom saying, "If it had to happen to one of us, why did it have to be you?" There's something special about a shipboard romance in the movies, and here you have two of the era's most charming, attractive stars falling in love. Grant and Kerr exhibit near-flawless chemistry as they glide through their scenes together. The characters have a light, easy manner, and the dialogue that flows between them is natural and full of wit. As Nicky Ferranti, Grant may be at his most debonair, though it's tough to be decisive on that point, since he's debonair in so many of his movies. Nicky is the world's most sought-after bachelor who's just been taken off the market. He's also an infamous womanizer whose new fiancée is the best friend of his previous flame. When he meets former nightclub singer Terry McKay, there's instant attraction. Deborah Kerr is striking here. Terry is feminine but not flashy, with seemingly effortless appeal. She's playful, and her quick, clever responses give him tit for tat. It's a stimulating change from what he's used to, especially when she rebuffs his attempts to make her a conquest, putting him in his place with a knowing smile. They keep bumping into each other, though, and as they get to know each other better, with the whole ship watching, the passing flirtation develops into something more. This wasn't their first screen pairing, nor was it their last. They starred together in 1953's Dream Wife, and in 1960 they appeared as a married couple in The Grass is Greener, both romantic comedies. Neither of those films has enjoyed the enduring popularity of An Affair to Remember, which a few decades ago got a new lease on life when Nora Ephron included numerous references to it in her 1993 film Sleepless in Seattle with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. The part where Tom Hanks and Victor Garber sit and listen to Rita Wilson describe the ending and get all choked up is the best scene in the movie, in my opinion. What a lot of people don't realize is that An Affair to Remember is a remake. In fact, it's director Leo McCarey's remake of his own film, 1939's Love Affair with Irene Dunne and Charles Boyer. I reviewed Love Affair several years ago, and those of you who have seen that video may recall that I am partial to it. It's awfully hard to get on a high horse about the movie being remade just 18 years later when it was the original director who did it. I wondered if it was the opportunity to take another stab at the material in scrumptious color that McCarey couldn't pass up. An Affair to Remember is a lush production filmed in CinemaScope, color by Deluxe, with a luxurious atmosphere in its first half that reflects the upper-class lifestyle to which Terry and Nicky are accustomed. But that doesn't seem like enough of a reason, and I've always wondered if McCarey felt dissatisfied with the original in some way. It turns out the answer is no. McCarey felt just fine about how things turned out the first time, and when all was said and done, he reportedly preferred his original take on the story. It was Cary Grant who pushed for a remake. Leo McCarey, despite having made a number of dramatic films, including the astonishingly emotional Make Way for Tomorrow, which I still can't think about for more than 3 seconds without wanting to cry, is mainly known for his 1930s screwball comedies, like the outrageous Marx Brothers film Duck Soup. He worked with Cary Grant and Irene Dunne on 1937's The Awful Truth, a huge success that established Grant's comedic persona, which in actuality was modeled after McCarey's own mannerisms. When McCarey came up with the concept for Love Affair, he wanted to cast those same stars. Dunne accepted the role, which included a few songs to showcase her voice. Cary Grant turned it down, and it went to Charles Boyer, but Grant occasionally visited the set and came to regret his decision. Years later, it was allegedly Grant who urged McCary to remake the film, with him in the lead, of course, and McCary agreed to do it. Certain elements were expanded a bit or tweaked, but essentially the screenplay remained the same, and the remake did very well, as its predecessor had, so well that it became a classic, and the older film has since struggled not to fall into obscurity. As for whether or not it counts as a Christmas movie, that depends on your criteria. I argue that it qualifies, not just because the final half hour takes place in December, but because the final scene, which is the most important scene, unfolds on Christmas and includes a significant Christmas present. Of course, Cary Grant has a much more obvious Christmas movie in his filmography, 1947's The Bishop's Wife, with Loretta Young and David Niven. I know a lot of people are fans of that one. I am not. My main issue with it, and this is going to sound crazy to some people, my main issue is that Cary Grant is just too perfect. I know he's supposed to be, but for me, he's so perfect that he's actually dull. By the way, I know, I'm sorry to all of you who love that movie, just didn't do much for me. By the way, Leo McCarey also has another famous Christmas movie under his belt, 1945's The Bells of St. Mary's, with Bing Crosby and Ingrid Bergman. One area where I think this film improves on Love Affair is in its fleshing out of the other people, the prior attachments. Nikki's new fiancé is an American heiress named, of all things, Lois Clark, played by Neva Patterson. She's a wealthy socialite type, and I don't think she's really in love with him. It strikes me as one of those, I'm rich and famous and attractive, and you're rich and famous and attractive, so we should be a couple things, but I do believe she comes to really care about him. The more sober way she interacts with him in her final scene suggests that to me. Meanwhile, for 5 years, Terry's been in a relationship with Ken, a successful businessman played by Richard Denning, who does not roll up his sleeves in this movie. Maybe if he had, things would have turned out differently for him. In full disclosure, watching this movie again was not on my radar until a couple months ago when I made that video about Richard Denning and his sleeves, the most important work I've done this year. I realized at that time that I didn't remember much about his character and his performance outside of that scene in the theater, so naturally I needed to see it again to refresh my memory. One big thing I had wrong, I always thought Ken was her fiancé, but no, that is not the case. He's a rich guy who found her singing in a nightclub and plucked her out of a seedy situation and became her benefactor, with whom she is also romantically involved. He set her up in an apartment with a view, he pays for all her nice, expensive clothes, sent her on this transatlantic cruise, so the film is somewhat vague about the exact nature of their relationship, but it's hinted that she is his mistress, or a kept woman, or, in more modern terms, he's a sugar daddy. My initial impression of Ken is mixed. Besides the fact that he's rich and looks like a movie star, he's friendly, enthusiastic, amorous, and intuitive. To a point. He doesn't know he's putting his foot in it with Terry when he makes a joke about Nikki, but he realizes what's amiss right away and gets straight to the point. In a way, he's very likable, but the audience has already formed an attachment to Cary Grant by the time they meet him, so he doesn't really stand a chance. It's Cary Grant, after all, one of the most popular movie stars ever. Plus, Ken kind of mollycoddles Terry, and you get the sense that he sees her as someone weak and flighty and not super bright who needs protecting, whereas Nikki appreciates her wit and strength and feistiness. The mollycoddling may or may not be a negative quality. I'd argue it depends on what the person on the receiving end wants. In Terry's case, She's grateful for what Ken provides, she's able to live in the lap of luxury thanks to him, but she doesn't love him, and that's no good. I give Ken a lot of credit for how he treats her after the breakup, especially when he meets her on her way to keep her appointment with Nikki. He's not jealous, he doesn't try to get her back, he sincerely wishes her well. But it's how he behaves after the accident that reveals what a stand-up guy he truly is. And if it weren't for the fact that Nikki is clearly the one for her, I'd be rooting for Ken. He stays by her side, he does everything she'll allow him to do to help her, he's considerate of her feelings. Notice how closely he watches her face when she sees Nikki at the theater. He's anxious about how it might affect her, and what harm it might do. He's supportive, and he's the biggest advocate for her happiness. He urges her to contact Nikki and tell him the truth, or to let him do it. You would think he'd resent Nikki, or resent both of them, but no, he still has feelings for her, but he doesn't let them get in the way, because more than anything, I think he wants to see her happy with the man she loves. And if that's not him, that's okay. And that's so decent! By the way, I'm with Ken 100%. The most frustrating thing about this story, in both versions, is her adamant refusal to let Nikki know what happened. I spend the second half of the movie, practically, internally screaming, just tell him! It's better to get it out there and see what comes next than to leave him wondering and thinking the worst. But I do understand that if she did that, then we wouldn't have that intensely dramatic, emotional ending, which I'll get to in a minute. Before it turns into a weep fest, An Affair to Remember has a good deal of comedy. It's not exactly a knee-slapper, but it has plenty of humorous moments and funny side characters, like the little fresh pants they rescue on the stairs, and the dry, impertinent TV personality Robert Q. Lewis playing himself. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's never gotten that pop culture reference. It's the visit to Nikki's sweet, doting grandmother, played by Kathleen Nesbitt, that changes the relationship, as the way they interact with her reveals another side of their personalities, further endearing them to each other. And of course, the wise old woman perceives what's happening before they do, and she's all for it. It's in this sequence that Terry McKay sings for the first time, Deborah Kerr's voice dubbed by Marni Nixon, who also sang for her a year earlier in The King and I. There's more singing in this movie than I remembered, meaning Nixon, who is uncredited, had to do quite a bit of work for what's technically a non-musical production. This sequence also marks a change in tone, with Janu's melancholy farewell and heartbreaking "I'm never going to see you again" hug. Back on the ship, Terry and Nikki acknowledge something's different, leading to the famous kiss scene. It's interesting that we have this popular romantic movie, yet the couple's first and most passionate kiss occurs off-camera. But if the first half of the movie is predominantly a comedy, the second half is predominantly a drama. The characters experience separation, difficulty, tragedy, and loss. That's also where it turns into a redemptive story, which is also appropriate for a Christmas movie, since redemption is really what Christmas is all about. Terry's circumstances are drastically altered, but it's Nikki who goes through the bigger character development, exchanging his self-indulgent playboy lifestyle for hard work and integrity. I don't know if Grant gets enough credit for his performance in this film, because some of the most touching scenes are ones where he's just standing there emoting. And if the story's successfully drawn you in, you feel all the emotions he's struggling with. It's hard to pinpoint what the saddest moment of the movie is, but I have to say I find the observation deck montage particularly awful, since you can hear sirens wailing in the background as Nikki waits, totally unaware, his disappointment mounting. In 1939, the censors put Love Affair through the ringer to make sure its dialogue and scenarios weren't too suggestive. They also were determined that these characters should be sufficiently punished for their self-indulgent, adulterous, checkered pasts, and not receive a happy ending too quickly and easily. Well, I don't think anyone could argue that the course of this love runs too smooth. Right up to the last minute, a first-time viewer might believe they're not going to end up together after all. Remember what I said about internally screaming, "Just tell him!" Yeah, that's going on through the entire final scene, at least for me. Maybe not for my mom, who was reaching for a tissue mere seconds into the scene. This is one of 3 movies, along with 1995's Mr. Holland's Opus and 1958's The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, which my mom loves and considers a favorite, but she can't watch anymore because she cries too much. Like, she starts crying early on and struggles through the whole movie, and by the end, whoa, it's just... She consented to watch it with me so I could review it, knowing full well what was bound to happen, and sure enough, the opening credits start with Vic Damone crooning the title song, and boom, she's already got tears in her eyes. Now, here's the part of the video I thought was going to be controversial. If you watched last week's video, at the end of it I said, tune in for another controversial review next week. In my review of Love Affair several years ago, I believe I said I didn't care for how Cary Grant delivers some of the dialogue in this last scene. I didn't like how bitter he was, because it was my impression he was being vindictive, trying to hurt her like she had hurt him, and I dislike the suggested cruelty of that, both in the immediate scene and in the long-term implications. By contrast, I preferred Charles Boyer's more aloof interpretation, where a defensive reflex makes him want to shrug it off, like being stood up wasn't that big a deal, yet he can't help giving himself away because he wants her to know how he suffered. I said something to that effect in my Love Affair review, and I fully expected to reiterate that here. However, I feel differently now, having just rewatched the entire movie. I have seen the film 2 or 3 times, start to finish, but I've caught just the last 20 minutes or so several times more. And seeing the confrontation on its own, my takeaway was that Nicky's words and attitude were caustic, his pain leading him to lash out at Terry in this thinly veiled way. But seeing it in context, it plays differently. He may have some bitterness recalling the night they were supposed to meet, and I think it's justifiable, but he seems more embarrassed and more frustrated by her refusal to explain. But the big thing to understand is that this is how they communicate with each other. Their talking is a form of playing, and this dialogue follows that same style, even though it's far from playful. I think this roundabout way of confessing what he felt and what he still feels is the only way he knows to talk about it. He's reversing their roles in telling the story, but they both know perfectly well what he's really saying. So I'm not as critical of this version of the scene now as I have been for the last few years. Context is everything. In either version, I always enjoy the way the scene builds up the anticipation. During Nicky's visit, he keeps walking around the room, no doubt wondering why she never gets up from the couch. Then he starts to leave, and you're like, no, don't go! But he pauses and begins to wonder and starts to look around more pointedly. And the best moment to me is the realization on his face as he stands in the doorway and it all clicks. I love me a good non-verbal moment of realization, and then there's the look on her face as he comes back, and if you weren't at least a little bit emotional already, I bet that'll do you in. Crying is contagious. My mom prefers this version. I do still like the 39 film better, and I'm not just saying that to be a contrarian. It's got a lot that holds special appeal for me for some reason. I like its frothy 30s-ness. I like Dunn's and Boyer's chemistry. It's got Maria Ouspenskaya, who's just adorable in that movie. I like the songs, I love the black and white, but they're both very charming, enjoyable films, and even though the way the conflict is prolonged in the third act seems slightly illogical and is certainly provoking, it's part of what makes it so memorable. An Affair to Remember is a beautiful film to look at, and a love story generations of people have found compelling, with appealing leads, compassionate and understanding supporting characters, and a satisfying ending. And for Christmas time, I at least find it suitable viewing. And those are my thoughts on An Affair to Remember. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you'll share your own thoughts on the movie. I do have one more video planned before Christmas, which should come out sometime in the middle of next week, so stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.